My nephew, David, has always been a part of my life, and I still remember the day he was born. My sister called me, her voice full of joy and exhaustion, to announce his arrival. That very first day, I held him in my arms, watching his tiny fingers wrap around mine. Time moves so fast. In the blink of an eye, David went from an infant to a young man. Now, at 25, he was a beautiful young man, and the boy I'd read bedtime stories to was suddenly an adult with dreams of his own. It was a summer evening when David decided to visit me. He had called me the week before and asked if he could come for a few days. He wanted a break from the hustle and bustle of the city and to relax in the quiet of the countryside, where my house had always stood, surrounded by the peace of nature. I welcomed him with open arms, looking forward to keeping him company with me again. The house stood at the end of a winding gravel road, hidden among tall trees and open meadows. It had once belonged to my parents, and growing up, my sister and I had spent countless hours in it. There was an old rocking chair on the porch, and the smell of fresh jasmine wafted in the air, mingling with the warmth of the setting sun. I had taken care to prepare for David his old room where he had stayed on many of our family visits. David arrived late in the afternoon, and a smile lit up his face as he hugged me tightly. He had grown taller since I had last seen him, and his shoulders had broadened. He looked like a man, but he still had that boyish glint in his eyes that I remembered from my childhood. We spent the first hour just chatting in the kitchen. He told me about his work, his future plans, his dreams of traveling, and how he missed the quiet of our old family home. I made his favorite meal, a simple stew with fresh bread, and we sat together at the table, talking and laughing as night fell around us. The air was warm, and I could see fireflies dancing outside the window. David always made me feel young again, as if the years had somehow rolled back and we were just aunt and nephew, like we always had been. Later that evening, I made sure everything was comfortable for David before heading to bed myself. His room was in the hallway next to mine, and I smiled at the thought of having him under the same roof again, just like old times. When the house was quiet, I found myself lying awake, my thoughts returning to the times he had stayed with us as a child. I wondered if he found the same comfort in staying here now that he was grown up. I didn't realize that David hadn't slept either, his thoughts keeping him awake. He mentioned that he always had trouble sleeping in the city because of the noise and the constant rush. I guessed that being here in the quiet countryside, with the familiar creaks of the house and crickets chirping outside the window, might bring him peace. The old clock in the living room ticked away the minutes, and somewhere the wind rustled the leaves, making a low whispering sound. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting a silvery glow all around. David's room had a beautiful view of the garden, and I knew it had always been one of his favorite places. He had told me once long ago that he loved to watch the stars from this window, imagining they were guiding him. That night, however, he couldn't look at the stars. Instead, he turned his head toward the hallway, and his thoughts returned to me. David knew that I meant the world to him, always had. He remembered the bedtime stories I read to him, the songs I hummed to help him fall asleep, how I cooked his favorite meals and helped him with his homework. I was his aunt, but somewhere in the back of his mind he felt something more. It was something unspoken, something that had no name, and he wondered if it was the right thing to feel. It wasn't a feeling that could be easily defined, but it was there in his heart. He got out of bed quietly, not wanting to break the silence of the night. He walked over to the window and looked out over the garden. The fireflies were still there, flickering in the darkness like tiny lanterns, and he could hear the wind rustling in the trees. His thoughts returned to me again, to the warmth of my smile, the sound of my laughter. He missed me somehow differently now. It was a feeling he couldn't explain. It was dark in the hallway when he came out of his room, trying not to make any noise. He wanted to see me, to make sure I was really here, that this was all real. He walked slowly, his bare feet tapping softly on the wooden floor. He found himself standing in front of my door, his heart pounding softly in his chest. He didn't realize what he was doing. He only knew he needed to see me. The door was slightly ajar, and he opened it just a little to peek inside. I was there, lying on my side, face calm and peaceful in sleep. The moonlight was coming through the curtains, making everything around me glow softly, and David felt his heart pound. He looked at me for a long moment, and a gentle smile played on his lips. He remembered how I had always taken care of him, how much love I had given him. He wanted to protect me, to make me happy, to be there for me in the same way. David knew he couldn't cross the line, couldn't wake me up, couldn't tell me how he felt. He didn't want to ruin the beauty of our connection, didn't want to lose the trust and love we had. He slowly withdrew, trying not to make a sound, and went back to his room. He lay awake for a long time, his thoughts occupied with me, the warmth of my laughter, the kindness in my eyes. The next morning I woke up early and made breakfast for both of us. David joined me in the kitchen, his hair disheveled from sleep, his eyes a little tired. He smiled at me as he sat down at the table, and I couldn't help but notice the way his gaze lingered on me, something softer, more tender than before. We talked as we usually did, but there was something else in the air, something unspoken. We spent the day together, walking through the garden, visiting the meadow where the wildflowers grew, talking about everything and nothing. David never took a step away from me, his hand touching mine every now and then, and his smile never leaving his face. I sensed that something had changed, but I didn't push him, just enjoyed the time we spent together, feeling closer to him than ever before. That night, before going to bed, David held me a little longer than usual, his arms wrapped tightly around me. I felt his warmth, his love, and I hugged him back, my heart bursting with tenderness. He whispered a quiet "thank you" before letting me go, and I smiled at him, not needing an explanation. I didn't need one. I knew this visit meant more to him than just a break from the city. As the days passed, David stayed with me and our bond grew deeper. We never talked about that night, the way he looked at me, how he felt. It was something that stayed between us, unspoken but understood. It didn't need words. It was a pure love that transcended notions of family. It was a bond we treasured, one that made our time together all the more precious. Eventually, David moved back to the city, but he started calling me more often, visiting when he could. And every time he came, we would sit in the garden, watching fireflies and talking until deep into the night. Our love was something that didn't need to be explained, something that just was. It was the kind of love that filled the spaces between words, made every moment special, and that was enough for both of us.